For this project, we're going to be doing some shading practice. So I've opened up this worksheet here in Illustrator, and you can see that there are two columns here, and in each column there are shapes with light sources next to them. This light source is going to tell us what direction the highlights and shadows need to be facing, but also depending on how close the light source is to the shape, that will kind of tell us how bright the highlight itself is. Because if you've ever taken a flashlight and a ball, if you hold the flashlight away from the object, like say a foot, it lights up the object really nice, and you've got a soft highlight that gradually kind of melds in to your darker shadows. But if you were to take that flashlight and move it super close to your ball, like say an inch away, you'll have this really super bright hot spot for your highlight. And there will be a transition between your shadow and your highlight, but it's not going to take up as much of the shape, and it's going to be a very short distance compared to when you were holding the flashlight a foot away. So that's something to kind of keep in mind when you are creating your own pieces. You need to think about where your light sources are. You need to think about how bright they are and how close they are to your subjects. That will control how you shade your objects. Now, the reason that there are two columns here, one is for Illustrator, one is for Photoshop, is because you kind of go about it different ways depending on the program. Illustrator is really great for doing like cell shading. So cell shading is where you have your highlights and your shadows, but they're kind of separate objects from your midtones, and there's not much of a blend or transition. There's nothing wrong with this style. If this is the way you want to shade things, this can look very effective in pieces. But if you want something that has more of a soft shading to it, it is possible to do that in Illustrator. You just kind of have to go about it in a slightly different way than Photoshop, because in Photoshop you can go about it in more a traditional way, like you would with either your pencil or a paintbrush, where you're just kind of painting in each layer to get it darker. In Illustrator, the way I go about using soft shading is I combine using my gradients and using the feather effect in here. So I'm just creating a base color for my first sphere here, and I'm going to go ahead and turn off the stroke as well, so that way it just looks like a solid shape. And then I'm going to go over to my gradient panel. If you don't see that off to your right, you can just go to Window and then Gradient. And with that object selected, I'm just going to click down in the slider here to apply it. And since a sphere has a curve to it and it's not straight, we don't want a linear gradient like this. We're going to go with a radial gradient, which is that middle option there. And in your sliders, you're going to want maybe like a light gray for your highlight, because if we're looking at a light source, it's kind of set back. It's not nearly as close as, say, like the cylinder. So we're going to do a more subdued highlight. But I still want a really dark shadow, so I'm not going to go full black. I'm just going to go with like a super dark gray. So I think that'll work for me. But one little problem we have is my highlight is in the center, and yet my light source says that the light should be coming from this upper left-hand corner. So what I'm going to do is, with this object selected, is I'm going to go to my gradient tool. It's going to be off to your left. It should be right underneath the mesh tool. The shortcut for the gradient tool is G, and what that will allow me to do is it gives me a bit more control over the placement and shape of the gradient. So the light source is coming from here, so I'm just going to follow it and say my highlight should be about there. And I'm going to click and then drag outward, and it's going to create this radial gradient that, rather than starting from the middle of the object, it's starting from that edge. And I'm just going to stretch it out to about there. And if I switch to my direct selection tool, you can see I've got this nice transition between my highlight right here and the shadow over here. And now what I need to add is I need to actually add a shadow underneath the shape itself. If you just worry about shading on the objects themselves and you don't put anything underneath it, you can kind of create this weird kind of floating effect that you may not want. Putting a shadow underneath it also kind of tells the viewer's eye where it is on the plane. So like if I put a shadow like directly underneath it, you can tell that this ball is on the ground. But if I were to move this shadow, so let's say a little bit down, you can tell that the sphere is floating up in the air. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab the ellipse tool. I'm going to make the fill black. And I'm going to create an ellipse that kind of goes like that. And the reason I'm making the ellipse there is because I know by following my light source is there's going to be empty space kind of following this back area. So if I were to think of this as a sphere, light travels in a straight line. So what it's going to do is it's going to hit the sphere, it's going to hit the sphere, and as it goes around the edge, it's going to hit slightly less of the sphere until finally it just glances completely past it. It's the same on this side too. It's going to keep hitting until finally it glances past it. And because this is, technically it's a 2D shape, but we're going to render it like it's a 3D shape, what it's doing along this edge here, it's also doing along this direction here. So I've got a light that's hitting until finally it just glances right by. And then that shadow is kind of going to be in this empty space directly behind it. So I'm going to grab my ellipse and I'm going to fill it with black. And I just made kind of a oblong ellipse here rather than a perfect circle. 'Cause if you've kind of ever looked at your shadow when you're outside, you kind of look really stretched out and you look like a thin man. So that's what I did with this here. Kind of the way the light hits the surface and what hits the surface and what doesn't. That empty space in between those isn't going to be an exact replica of this shape here. With some harsher lights, you can get like a direct copy, and depending on how close it is to the surface, but usually you're going to get an oblong version of whatever your shape is. So when I created my ellipse, you can see it has this overlapping issue. I'm just going to right click, go to arrange, and send to back, and I'll put it underneath my object here. So I think that's good on my placement. I might just rotate it, and I'm just using my selection tool to move this around and resize it. But I think I'm fairly happy with it. The problem is I've got this really harsh line here, and I want to do more of a soft shading kind of look. So I'm going to select the object, and I'm going to go to Effect, Stylize, and Feather, and that will help soften up my edge here. So I think 2.5 or 0.25 should work. And I'm going to bring this just a little bit forward because the darkest part is going to be directly underneath the shape. And there are going to be some shadows in front of it because of the way a sphere works. There are going to be some spots where the light's going to hit, and like directly underneath it. It's not going to hit underneath the sphere. So I'm just going to shift this until the darkest part is underneath it. Maybe stretch it out a bit more. And I'm going to duplicate this. And the way I'm duplicating it is I'm just holding Alt, hitting the right arrow, letting go of the Alt. On a Mac computer, it'll be Option. And then I'm going to hit the left to put it back in place. And I'm just going to resize this So that way it's a little bit smaller. And I'm just going to put this directly underneath, so that way that bit's just a little bit darker. And I'm going to go to Appearance. If you've ever added an effect to an object and you need to edit it, find your Appearance panel. If you can't find it, just go to Window and Appearance. And whatever effects you have applied to an object should show up in there. And I'm just going to go to Feather by double clicking on it. And I'm just going to change this that way it's a bit smoother. So there we go. That way you can't really tell there are two ovals on top of this. It just looks like this is a smooth transition. So I'm happy with how that sphere turned out. And now I'm going to move on to the cylinder. Now the side of a cylinder kind of works like a sphere does. It has a curved side to it. So when I go in with my light, it's going to hit and create kind of a slope or a curve going on. It's not going to be dead straight like you would see with a cube. Because different parts of the side are going to be at different distances from your light source. So that's what creates that transition there. But you can see I have it coming from a different direction this time. And I also have the light source a lot closer. So there's going to be a hot spot around here. And this top part is going to be very dark, and maybe the sides will be dark as well. But this is definitely going to be drastically different from this curved part of the cylinder, because this edge right here is at a 90-degree angle. So basically, unlike the sphere where everything was just slowly facing more and more away from the light source, on this one, pretty much all the light is going to hit at the same rate along your vertical axis right up until it gets to the edge. Then the light source is going to go completely past it. So it's always going to hit about there until it gets to the edge, and then it just goes right past it. So the light's not going to be able to reach this top. So it's going to be a much darker value than what the side is down here. So this has been broken up into a shape that we can easily shade here. I'm going to pick a light gray for it. That way we can actually show our highlight really well on it. And I'm going to turn off the stroke again. And I'm going to do the same for the lid here. Okay. So I'm going to go back to my gradient panel. And I'm going to apply the gradient by just clicking in the slider. But this time we don't want a radial gradient, because the rate of change for when the light hits the surface here, it's always going to be the same vertically. So that means we're going to need a linear gradient, because every color going up and down is going to be the same here. It's going to be the same here, here, and here. But I do need to move that highlight over, so you can see from where the light source is on here, the hot spot will be about there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my dark value to the right or to the left, and then to the right of it, I'm going to just click in that empty space, and it'll add another slider for me. And I'm going to move this one to the end, and I'm going to move this one left and move my highlight between the two. So that way it's dark on both sides, and I've got the highlight in the middle here that I can move. So I'm just going to move these, so that way the highlight matches up with where the light source says it's coming from. And I'm going to make this a slightly darker gray, so that way the transition isn't quite so harsh. And I'm grabbing this diamond here. This diamond controls the blend. So you can see if I bring it all the way up to the edge, the transition between this color and this color travels a really short distance, whereas if I were to bring it more into the middle, that transition is more stretched out, or I can bring it all the way to the end there, and that light gray travels a lot more before it starts transitioning into the dark. So I'm just going to move it so that way the dark gray kind of takes up more of this edge here rather than traveling this whole length. And I might even make this left one a slightly lighter gray. I still want it darker than this one, but I want it to be lighter than this one. Because there's going to be more of the cylinder that's curving before it'll actually reach the super dark gray. So from the angle we see, it's going to be more of a lighter gray. Still going to be much darker than this one, but it's going to be lighter than this one. And I'm pretty happy with that. But because the light source is so bright, it's going to create more of a focus spot here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my ellipse tool and kind of create a hot spot. I'm just going to pick white for the fill. And I think I'm going to do something a lot skinnier, but I'm going to heighten it a bit more. Then I'm going to do what I did for the shadow up here. I'm going to add a feather to it. So I'm going to go to Effect, Stylize Feather. And I'm just going to bring this up. I think about there should work. I'll hit OK. And I'm just going to move this around until I get the look I want. I'm just using my direct selection tool to kind of change the shape of the ellipse here so it's more tear shaped. I think that's good, but I'm going to add a transparency to this. So I'm going to go to my transparency panel. It'll take two circles overlapping each other. If you can't find it, just go to Window and Transparency. And it'll bring up that panel for you. And I'm just going to lower the opacity a bit. So that way this center isn't a solid white. It's more see-through. And this is just going to kind of make it look like there is a spotlight shining on it. I'm just switching between my selection and my direct selection tool. That's the black and white arrows. I'm just going to keep messing with the placement and the opacity until I'm happy with it. So I think that's good for the side here. And you can see if I were to move this object over, that feathering is going past the shape. I don't want that because when we do this column, we're going to bring it into Photoshop as a PNG, which means this canvas is going to be transparent and we're going to see this fluffy edge again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the side of the cylinder here and I'm going to duplicate that. The way I'm doing it is I'm holding Alt or Option, hitting the right arrow, letting go of Alt or Option, and then hitting the left arrow to put it back into place. And I'm going to make this pure white. And then I'm going to select this hot spot we created, and I'm going to select the side that we made pure white. And in your transparency panel, there's a button that says Make Mask. And what that allows us to do is now this hot spot is cut off at that edge there. The reason I didn't just duplicate this and then select the hot spot and the side and then use intersect in Pathfinder is what that does is it creates a brand new shape from where those two things intersect. And what that means is the feather would then be applied to this top arch here, but it'd also be applied to this curve down here, and I don't want that. I want that to remain a very hard edge. So that's why I use the mask, because the hot spot, the original shape or the teardrop we made is still there. It's just hidden behind a mask. So like I talked about earlier, it's going to be a gradual change in your light along the side of the cylinder, but it's going to blast completely past the top here, and that's going to change how the light hits it. So I'm going to make that a darker gray. Kind of picked a gray that kind of matches the tone maybe over here. I didn't pick a dark gray like I used for the very edge. I just kind of picked a gray that's between my highlight and shadow, but a little bit closer to my shadow on the spectrum. And sometimes in some scenes you have like ambient light, which means you have light kind of bouncing all over the room you're in. So sometimes it'll add a slight glow to this. So if you want, you can just go to your gradient. And I'm going to click on my fill here and drag it into the slider, so that way it'll use that color in the gradient. And what you can do is you can kind of add a gradient, so that way there is a slight highlight along the edge. You can kind of mess with the different ways to do that. But you can just use your gradient tool to fix it. I think of the linear might work a little bit better. So there. So if you want, you can kind of have a bit of light catching off that edge there, but primarily most of the shape is going to be in shadow there. Okay, so now I need to add the shadow behind my cylinder here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these shapes, duplicate them, and then I'm going to merge them all into one shape and make it black. And what I need to do is I need to kind of have it stretched out and going this way. So in order to easily do that, I'm just going to go to Effect, Distort and Transform, and Free Distort. And that will kind of allow me to make a shape that looks like it's laying down. So I'm just grabbing the corners here and just moving them around the way I want them to. I think that's going to end up looking good, so I'll just hit OK once I'm happy with it. And then I'm going to send it backwards. And I'm just going to move this that way fits a little bit better. Because all the light is going to be hitting this edge, hitting this edge, hitting this edge until it goes right past it here. So I'm just going to rotate it a slight bit. And then I'm going to add that feather to it to soften that shadow. have to adjust this. I think that looks good for what we want. Might heighten this. So a nice thing about what it's doing is if you go into your appearance panel, is it's still maintaining the original shape. It's just adding an effect to it that makes it look distorted. If we got rid of this free distort, it's going to go back to the original shape here. Alright. I'm going to duplicate this. Just make it a little shorter. And I'm going to adjust the feather on it. So I'm going to call it good on the cylinder there. So next up is we're going to move on to our cube. Now, unlike these two shapes here, a cube doesn't have any slow changing curves on it. All of the angles are very harsh. So if I look at my light source here, it's going to hit, 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 until it gets to the edge, and then it's just going to completely miss. And as it gets to this edge, it's going to hit, and then it's going to completely miss. There is no gradual change. So the only real gradient you'd see up on the side that's facing your light source is it depends on how diffused your light source is. So if it's super strong, you're likely only going to get one value up on the top here. If it's more of a diffused glow, you might get like a hot spot in the middle here, and it might taper off into a slightly darker value off to the edges. But usually if you got like a block and you looked at it, usually the top's going to be one tone. So I'm just going to select this top part. And I'm going to pick maybe like a light gray, because that light source is not as close as what we had here. It's about the same distance as what we had on our sphere, so we're going to make a gray that's about a similar shade. It doesn't really matter as long as if these all match or not. What matters is that your lightest is always very clearly your highlight, and it is a vast change from your shadow. So now for these sides here, because that light is coming up almost on top, we're going to add a gradient to it, so there's like a little bit of light coming off that edge, but it's mostly going to be super dark on these sides here. So I'm going to, if I go to where like this angle is, I'm just going to type in 90 so that way it faces the right way up. And this just switches your slider really quick, so if a color's on the wrong end, rather than having to grab them and move them into the right places, you can just hit that and it'll flip them around for you. So there's my highlight, and I'm going to make this like super dark. Not completely black, but I'm also going to darken that a bit more. And I'm going to get rid of that stroke on that side. And I'm going to match this so that way it's a reverse of the other one. So I'm just going to select the shape and use my eyedropper to copy the gradient down so that way it gets the placement of the blender there. And all I have to do is just change the angle on it. I think that was good. I think I might go back and add more of a diffused glow to the top just so it makes this look a little bit more interesting. I'm just using my gradient tool to adjust it. There you go. So that way it looks like there's a hot spot like right in that center, and the edge is slightly darker. And I'm going to adjust these sides that way there's a bit more of a differentiation between the two. I don't think my angles are quite right. I'm going to make this a really bright white so I can see my angle a bit better. Okay, I think that looks good. And then because the light is kind of coming down like this, the empty space is pretty much going to be directly underneath the shape. So we're just going to do like one big spot directly underneath it. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to grab my pen tool, and I'm going to put one point like right there, one there, one in the middle, one here, one going through that corner, one in the middle. I want to make sure it's lined up with this corner, and then back over here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add my feather now, and I'm going to send it backwards so that way I can see what it looks like as I'm working with it, and I can readjust it using my direct selection tool. So with the shape selected, I'm going to go to stylize feather. Now I don't want a huge feather on it, so I'm just going to do 0.05 inches. Then I'm just going to hit OK. Send this backwards. And then I'm going to use my direct selection tool to grab these anchor points and move them around the way I want them to look. I think something like that looks good. So now I'm going to do my pyramid here. Now the pyramid's a lot similar to the cube. There's no smooth curves on it, so the transition between values is going to be very harsh as we go from side to side. So the way this light source is going is it's hitting this, hitting this, hitting this, and then as it kind of goes left to right, it'll eventually hit this edge and then go right past it. Now something to keep in mind though is unlike the cube where this is going straight up and down, this is going at a slant or a slope. So as the light source hits it, it's going to hit it then, it's going to hit a little farther, a little further, a little further. So that means our highlight is going to travel along there rather than just going straight up and down like this. So I'm going to grab that side, take off the stroke, and we're going to add a gradient to it. So I'm just going to click that. So it's going to be kind of similar to our cylinder where we had this highlight with the shadows on either side of it. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to have my highlight, maybe pick a slightly lighter color, 'cause that light source is a lot closer than what the cube was at. So I don't want super white. There we go. So try that. And then we'll grab this end and move it away from the edge. Place another slider there and sandwich this highlight between the two. So I'm not going to worry about the angle too much right now. I'm just going to worry about the blend. So I think that's good. I just need to change the angle. So I'm going to grab my gradient tool and I'm going to change it so that way the highlight is traveling up this way. I almost want to keep it parallel with this bottom edge down here. I think I'm going to call that good. But sort of with my cylinder, I am going to want to add like a hot spot like right here. So I'm just going to create an oblong ellipse. Or ellipse. And it's going to make it white and add a feather. And I'm just going to rotate it so that way it fits on the triangle. I want to make it look like there's kind of a spotlight on it, so I'm just going to I'm going to mess with the feather a bit more. Then I'm going to call that good. Now, because the light is hitting directly there, let me pick a different color here. So because it's hitting directly there, directly there, directly there, it's going to shoot right past this. So we're going to do like we did with our cube, where we'll add a slight highlight to this edge here. But we don't want a huge gradient. So I'm not going to worry about the angle right now. I'm just going to get the actual colors down. Maybe put like pick a gray between my highlight over here and the shadow, so not all the way. I don't want it the same color as my highlight over here. I want it a little bit darker. I think that'll be good, and then I'll just use my gradient tool to fix that angle. I actually want most of that side to be dark gray, so that's why I'm only letting the gradient transition a little ways. And then let's take off that stroke so I can actually see how that's blending. I think I have a stroke on this as well. No? Ah, there was a spare stroke in there. So there we go. And now I just need to add the shadow, and the shadow is kind of going to go this way. So now to actually create the shadow, what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to grab my pen tool. I'm going to set the fill to black. And I'm going to put an anchor point at this corner. And I'm going to go up. Create the point of my pyramid. Then I want to go down to this corner. And then just fill out the shape. Then I'm just going to right click, arrange, send to back. And then I can use my direct selection tool if I need to distort this. And sometimes it'll look a little bit better once you go to Effects, Stylize, and Feather. So maybe 0.125 should work. And I'm just going to mess with this a little bit more. Then I might change the transparency, see how that looks. So I think I'm going to call that good. So those are all my shapes shaded in Illustrator. Now I'm going to go over to Photoshop and do these. But in order to do that, I'm going to export this as a PNG. And I'm going to make sure I have Use Artboards checked marked. And I'm just going to put my last name on this. And name it shading exercise.png. And just hit export. Make sure the resolution is set to 300. And then just hit OK. And then I'm going to save this AI file as well. Just that way if something happens, I always have the raw file. Okay. Now I've just opened that PNG in Photoshop. And what I'm going to do is, first thing is I'm just going to make a new layer. And what I'm going to do is on this new layer, I'm going to right click and go to Create Clipping Mask. And what that allows me to do is no matter where I color, it's going to keep it within whatever is already on the layer below it. So if I were to take this clipping mask off, you can see as I color, it's just putting it everywhere. Whereas if I create the clipping mask, it keeps it to whatever solid shapes are already there. So that's going to make coloring these in a little bit easier. When we do the shadows underneath them, what we're going to do is we're just going to make a new layer and put them underneath both of them to create that look. But for right now, we're just going to worry on shading the actual shapes right now. So I'm just going to pick a gray. I'm going to go about halfway between black and white. And I'm just going to completely fill in this shape so I have a nice base coat. So I'm just going to approach this like I would a traditional paintbrush or a traditional pencil, where I'm just going to pick my highlight. And I'm going to go a bit lighter than what I want. And I'm going to make sure that I have a nice soft edge, so hardness is set to 0. I want a fairly big brush. And then I'm going to pick a low opacity. And what I'm going to do, there we go. So I have the opacity set around 5%. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay in one layer at a time. So I think that looks good. Then I'm going to go one more, except I'm not going to go all the way to the edge down here like I did earlier. I'm going to stop a little bit sooner. So like that. Do it again. And I'm just clicking and lifting up, pressing and lifting up until I get that nice smooth transition that I want. And then I'm going to pick a darker color and I'm going to go in and add my shadows. I'm going to use a very similar technique where I have a low opacity. Might bump this up to like 13. And I'm going to put in one swipe. I'm going to put in another swipe, but not as far as the first one. Third one. I'm just going to keep going and I'm going to approach the edge a little more each time. So you can see I have this transition here, but there you can see a little bit of banding in it. I don't want that. So I'm going to go ahead and save this real quick. And I'm going to save it as a Photoshop file. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my Smudge Tool. The Smudge Tool looks like a finger kind of smearing across a surface. If you can't see it, look for the Blur Tool or the Sharpen Tool. And then what I'm going to do is, with a strength around 40% and with a big brush, I'm just going to go in and kind of smooth out these rings a bit using the Smudge Tool. And the reason I had you save right beforehand is the Smudge Tool takes a bit of processing power for it to do its thing, and sometimes if you try to do too much at once or with too strong of a brush, it kind of has a tendency to crash Photoshop. So when you're using the Smudge Tool, save often. So I've still kind of got a hard edge there, so I'm just going to use my eyedropper and pick that mid-tone. And I'm just going to go back in with my brush and just kind of smooth it over. And with the eyedropper, I just picked up that mid-tone. And I'm switching back to my Smudge Tool. And I think I'm going to call that good. So you can kind of see the difference. The shading we did in Illustrator is a lot smoother. This kind of has a more painterly style to it, which some people really prefer. Kind of depends on what approach you're kind of going for. And now what we're going to do is we're going to add the shadow underneath it. But because we have this clipping mask, it's not going to let us color underneath the shape. So what we need to do is make a new layer. And we're going to put it underneath everything. And I'm just going to rename that shadow. And then with a black brush, I'm going to turn the opacity up solid, but I still want a soft edge to it. And what you can actually do is we can make an ellipse here. Color that in, add a fuzzy edge to it. If you need to trim it up, you can just grab your eraser tool and put a fuzzy edge on that. So that way you can just clean up. And then I'm just going to use my free transform tool. Just kind of move this where it needs to be. If you want to distort it non-proportionally, just hold shift on your keyboard and it will let you change one side at a time rather than changing everything at once. So it's still way darker than what I need it to be, so I'm going to go in with my eraser. And I'm just going to do one smooth, maybe not that much. And I'm going to pick a low opacity and I'm just going to do one smooth swipe on it. And then I'm going to go around the edges. And make them really transparent. And then I can always go back in with my brush, pick a low opacity, and I can kind of darken directly underneath the shape here. And remember, save, and you can use your smudge tool to kind of change the blending and shape a little bit. There we go. I'm going to call that good. Might actually change the angle. There. Then I'm going to go back to my clipping mask here, and the angles are still going to be the same here. It's just mostly about how you paint it. So I'm going to pick my solid tone, just wash the shape in that tone. And I'm just going to worry about getting a nice gradient on the side of this cylinder here. I'm not going to worry about the top. I can come back to that here in a sec. So I'm just going to go in, and with my highlight, a fuzzy brush, and a low opacity, I'm going to go in and add my highlight. Then for this side, when I'm going in with the smudge tool, I'm not going straight across like that. I'm following the curve of the cylinder here. Then I'm going to go in with a dark tone and add my shadows. Again, this side's going to be a lot darker than what the other side's going to be. And I'm just going in one layer at a time. I'm just going to add a slight shadow to this side. I'm not going to go nearly as dark as I did over here. There we go. And then I'm just going to use my smudge tool. Just kind of smooth this out. I'm not going directly left to right. I'm adding a slight curve to this. And you can also kind of select the area you want to effect and go to filter and blur. That's another nice way to blend your shades really quick. So you see that kind of smooths it out and gets rid of that painterly feel we have in the sphere there. So I just went to filter, blur, and Gaussian blur. And I'm just going to go one more time with my brush and just kind of make that hot spot a little brighter. So I'm just going to go with my eraser. And you can kind of see some of my shading bled onto my light source here, so I'm just getting rid of that real quick. Alright, so now we can deal with the lid of the cylinder here. So since we've still preserved the original image, I'm going to select that layer, grab my wand tool, which is this tool right here. If you don't see it, look for your quick selection tool or object selection tool. Just right click on it and select magic wand tool. And then with that original layer, the layer that had the worksheet on it, select that and just click on the top and it'll select that lid there, and we can go back to our shape shade. And I'm going to pick one of these darker grays here. I'm going to go in with a brush and I'm actually going to darken that whole lid up. Then I'm going to pick the really dark shade and get that back edge. Then just use my smudge tool. And if I hit Command D, I need to fix that. Okay. Just gonna fix there. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. We just need to add that back shadow. So I'm gonna go back to my bottom layer, grab a black, a fuzzy brush, and pick a low opacity. And I'm just gonna go in, make sure I'm following the light source. I'm just going to do a really rough shape for my shadow. Do the first one all in one stroke, and then you can lift up, add your second layer, add your third. The closer the shadow is to the actual object, the darker it's going to be. So that's why I'm going to make this corner really super dark. Then I'm just going to use my lasso tool to section this off and go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, just to help kind of smooth out those values. And then use my move tool as needed. Okay, and I'm just going to erase that little bit down here, and I'm going to call that good. So again with the cube, I'm going to pick my base coat. fill that cube in. And then I'm going to select the layer that has the worksheet on it and select that top side that's facing the light source. And I'm going to go in with a light color and a low opacity, and I'm going to go in and add that hot spot. Yep. Make sure you're adding it to the shape shade. And then I'm just using that Gaussian blur to kind of smooth out my paint strokes. Use the smudge tool to change the shape and kind of bring in more of that gray. Again, when you're using the smudge tool, save often. Okay, I'm going to call it good for that side. I'm going to go back to the layer with the worksheet, use my magic wand to select that side. And since this is going to be a really smooth gradient, I'm actually going to grab my gradient tool. If you don't see it, just look for your paint bucket tool and right click on it. And then I'm going to make sure that this is set to basic, and I'm going to select that first option. So that way it uses my foreground and background colors. And I'm going to select a shade that's a little bit lighter than my base coat. And then I'm going to pick a shadow that's really dark. Not all the way black, just like maybe super dark gray. And then with my gradient tool, make sure it's set to linear. That's the first option. And I'm just going to drag straight down. Maybe a little bit off kilter here. I don't want there to be a whole lot of light, so maybe just might lighten up my dark hue. I think we'll call it good. I'll select the other side. Do the same thing with my gradient. I'm just going to use my smudge tool to kind of blend these two edges together a little bit more. I think I might actually use a brush, see how that works. So we'll just call this good. We'll go back to that bottom layer. Pick a dark color, low opacity. And just add our shadow almost directly underneath our shape here. Then I'm just going to use my smudge tool fix this. I can always use my lasso, use my blur filter, smooth that out a bit more if I wanted to. Okay, and then we'll move on to our pyramid here. So again, select a base coat. Apply that base coat evenly. And now we can go in and start painting in our gradients onto each side. So I'm just going to add a hot spot onto this side. And I'm using a dark gray to create my shadows here. It's not putting in any super dark shadows because that light source is still hitting that front-facing surface. I just want to add a bit of a differentiation between the highlight and the mid-tones towards the edge. And then I'm going to use my filter, blur, Gaussian blur, smooth out those strokes. I'm happy with that side. Select this side. Put a slight highlight along this edge. But most of it's going to be in shadow. Again, I'm just using a low opacity. And I'm just putting it in one stroke at a time. It's much easier to darken things than it is to try and lighten them. I'm just using my smudge tool to kind of touch this up a little bit. Then I'm going to add my shadow here. Again, the first layer of the shadow I want to do all in one stroke. And then I can go in and start putting in the layers. Remember, the shadow's closest to the edge of the object are going to be the darkest. I'm just resizing it and changing the rotation. Gonna use an eraser to kind of clean this edge up a bit. Then I'm happy with it. I'm gonna go ahead and add another layer, put it at the very bottom, just fill it in with white. So it's a little easier to see everything. And you can go in and adjust your shadows if you want to. You can either just change the max opacity, or you can go in and change them individually. But go ahead and add any touch-ups you need at this point. Once you're happy with it, go ahead and just save it. And you're done.